Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dursey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio Chapter of APA and Chair of the APA New Urbanism Division, and I'm your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, October 21st, and we will hear the presentation, Goats in the City, Targeted Grazing for Low Impact Management of Sensitive Landscapes. For technical help during today's webcast, just type your questions in the chat box in the webcast toolbar. It should be on the right of your screen, or you can call the 1-800 number shown. And for your content questions related to the presentation, you can type those in the questions box, also located in the webinar toolbar to the right of your screen. And we will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. On your screen is a list of the sponsoring chapters and divisions for 2016. Thanks to all of our participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to their members. Today's webcast in particular is sponsored by the Nebraska Chapter of APA. And to learn more about them, you can visit planning.org/chapters/Nebraska. And on your screen now is a list of our upcoming webcasts. You can register for these webcasts by going to our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And you'll notice that we have some reserved spots for 4 of our upcoming webcasts, so just keep checking back and we'll have those updated. To log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, just head over to planning.org and log into your My APA account. Then under the CM log, you can select to search for CM activities and either type in the name of today's webcast or the event number, both of which can be found on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to receive up-to-date information on our sessions. We will be posting on our Facebook page when those pending sessions, those reserved sessions, are live and ready to go for registering. And we are recording today's webcast. It will be available on our YouTube channel. Just head over to youtube.com/planningwebcast. And you'll also be able to get a PDF after the session ends, again, on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. All right, with that out of the way, I will be turning it over to today's presenter, Aaron Steele. Aaron, it's all you.
Okay, thanks, Christine. How do we look?
You're looking good.
All right, excellent. Well, good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are. It's a pleasure to be with you today to talk about targeted grazing and its relationship to community planning and city and county governments. I'm excited to be here and looking forward to visiting with you this morning. Just a little bit about me. I've been working as a planner for nearly 20 years, both with a regional planning organization here in Iowa and also a county in Iowa, and also for a private industry association. Unfortunately, my usual co-presenter on this presentation, Wade Wagoner, is unable to join today. But Wade also has a long history of planning in the Midwest, in the Kansas City area, and also in Iowa. And actually, we have worked at the same industry association, and so we've been co-workers in the past, both working as planners there. Most relevant to this presentation is Wade's work up until 2015 as the city administrator of a small town in northwest Iowa called Lake Park. So that's going to be the focus of our conversation today, is targeted grazing and its relationship to this particular project in this particular community in northwest Iowa. So what's this presentation all about? You know, maybe it was not completely obvious in the description of this session what this presentation would be about. You might be thinking that this is about urban agriculture or about how do we go one step further from backyard chickens and start to allow goats in backyards and communities, and that's not really what we're after today. Instead, we want to talk about goats in use for targeted grazing and the applications that can be found in communities. In particular, we're going to highlight this one project from Lake Park, Iowa. Lake Park is this tiny little town, about 1,500 people, and they have a beautiful lake, but this lake was often invisible due to invasive and non-native vegetation that was growing up on the shorelines of this lake. One of the greatest assets of this community is a park right on the lake shore. This park is a community center. It includes a campground. It includes the local high school's football field and football stadium, as well as some other other recreational amenities, city swimming pool, and of course, access to this lake. Fantastic for this little community to have this asset, but it often wasn't even visible because of the vegetation that was growing up on the shoreline. That led to this crazy idea from City Administrator Wade Wagoner. What about goats? He knew that though I'm a planner, I moonlight as a goat herder, and that I had recently started this business, this targeted grazing business, and we started visiting about the possibilities of using this service at Lake Park. Seemed like a crazy idea at the time, but the more we talked about it, the more things started to fall into place and the more it made sense for the city. It was a crazy idea that became something much bigger. It proved that the city was innovative, that they were thinking outside the box when it came to solutions to their problems. It provided a level of community engagement that this city had not seen before. It generated momentum for water quality improvements in the community that had not taken hold before the goats arrived. It had lots of unexpected benefits for the morale and the economic development of Little Lake Park. So this presentation is going to be about all those things. It's also going to be about how we can make this crazy idea and this crazy solution something that is much more mainstream in communities across the country. So let's talk about Lake Park for a little bit. As I mentioned, Lake Park is pretty small. In fact, probably in Iowa, it has to be one of the smallest communities with a full-time city administrator. And what that meant for Wade was that he had a lot of flexibility in what he could do and what projects the city would undertake. And right off the top there, you'll see this water tower in Lake Park with a brand new brand on it. This was one of Wade's very first projects in the community. You know, one of the other benefits of being a city administrator in a small town is that you can focus your efforts on morale and community and pride. And so this was a very likely first project for a new city administrator to take this old water tower and give it a facelift. You'll see there on the map the red county clear up in the northwest part of the state. That's where Lake Park is located. Lake Park has some fantastic advantages location-wise and also some major disadvantages location-wise. They are not near any urban center in the state of Iowa. Very small town surrounded by farmland. However, they are only about 10 or 15 miles west of a major tourist attraction in Iowa, and that is a chain of lakes called the Okobojies. West and East Lake Okoboji and Big Spirit Lake, as well as several other smaller lakes, attract lots of summer visitors. They attract lots of second homes, and they have very expensive real estate on the shores of those lakes. Unfortunately, Lake Park is just a little too far west, so they're unable to capture a lot of the benefits of that tourism and the dollars that get pushed into this county, despite the fact that they have a very nice lake themselves. So that leaves Lake Park searching for an identity often, and that's something that this project was able to help with a little bit, and so we'll talk more about that here in a few minutes. This is a picture of the lake and a little bit of the edge of Lake Park, Iowa. It's a nice setting. It's really pretty. Incidentally, this lake came to be like many of the, well, almost all of the other lakes in this region of northwest Iowa. This is part of the prairie pothole region. Originally, before settlement, this entire area was prairie with these scattered pothole lakes and ponds and sloughs and marshes. It's part of a geographic landscape that extends from North Dakota down into northeast South Dakota, southwest Minnesota, and right down into northwest Iowa. And so there are little lakes like this kind of all over the region. And in a sense, they're nothing unique. However, as I mentioned, just to the 10 miles down the road to the east, those lakes are unique. They're prairie pothole lakes, but for whatever reason, they were carved out to be much more deep, cold water lakes, and thus their attractiveness to all those tourists. The bottom image here shows a little bit more of that park. And as you can see, we've got some great amenities at this little park for the city of Lake Park, but off to the left there, you can just see little bits of blue through the vegetation, and that's the lake trying to peek through. And so you get an idea of the problem. Another picture showing the problem. Again, you can see the lake in the background, but we have a lot of vegetation, kind of creating an unwanted buffer between the lake and the users of this park. And the vegetation itself wasn't the only problem. The steepness of the lakeshore was a problem too. That's what allowed this non-native vegetation to become established in the first place. It is just impossible to maintain this lakeshore to any great degree with powered equipment or with human effort. So you get an idea of how steep this is. This is the one stairway going down from the park to the lakeshore. And you can see along this railing here how it is lined with a pretty dense jungle of vegetation. This stuff is thorny, nasty. There's poison ivy in here, all sorts of stuff. And I can tell you the Public Works Department was not very excited about going in and working on that steep lakeshore with chainsaws. So Lake Park had a few options here. They could do nothing, and looking back on it now, we realize that they would have missed an incredible opportunity to just let this go another year or another 5 years. They could have used heavy equipment, which would have been very expensive and very disruptive to the park and the lakeshore, and actually created an opportunity for a great deal of erosion. They could have sent in city workers with chainsaws. That would have been dangerous, and it would have been quite temporary. Or they could do something crazy, like hire a crew of goats and start thinking bigger about the problem, that perhaps this isn't just a lake visibility problem, but this is a landscape level problem. So I'm going to pause there for a moment and just tell you a little bit about Goats on the Go. Goats on the Go is a business that I started with a partner back in 2012. Yes, that means I am a community planner and a goat herder. And I don't know, maybe there are others like me out there, but I think that's somewhat unique. If you are a community planner and a goat herder out there listening to this right now, would you please contact me, because I could use some company. We are Iowa's only professional targeted grazing company that is operated on a continuous basis for any meaningful amount of time. We are in 2017 planning to launch a national network of affiliate companies that will all work under our brand, so that we can do more work on a local level and expand our geographic reach. Who knows, maybe that could be somewhere close to the community where you're listening to this right now. We currently have large project capability all over the Midwest. When we reach a certain scale on a project, we can justify sending out large numbers of goats and kind of deploying our full force on a project, and that does make it cost effective more or less throughout the Midwest at the moment. Clients in the past have included the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, lots of state, county, and city parks, and we have worked for private property owners in urban, suburban, and rural landscapes many times here in the Midwest. So what is targeted grazing? It is the application of a specific kind of livestock at a determined season, duration, and intensity to accomplish defined vegetation or landscape goals. You might hear it called conservation grazing or prescribed grazing, just depending on where you are in the country, and what any one provider chooses to call their service. We tend to go with the term targeted grazing. Grazing has kind of a sketchy history here in the United States. In fact, it's still a subject of a lot of controversy and conflict. We typically don't associate conservation and grazing together. Grazing has proven to be quite damaging to some landscapes. But I would suggest here that we're talking about something completely different. What makes targeted grazing an application that actually promotes conservation and promotes sustainability is this details in this definition about a determined season, duration, and intensity, defined landscape goals. So as it turns out, what can make grazing damaging is not grazing itself or the animals themselves. They're just doing what they do, what they were created and evolved to do. What makes it harmful to the landscape is the degree to which good management is applied. And when we talk about targeted grazing, we're talking about a high level of supervision and monitoring of the animals and the project and the vegetation to make sure that we're using the grazing to accomplish certain goals and having as few adverse side effects as possible. So communities face a bunch of vegetation challenges where goats could be a good application. Dangerous or invasive or nuisance vegetations in parks and trails. Sometimes vegetation is all three of those: dangerous, invasive, and nuisance. We're often called to deal with invasive vegetation that tends to be an ever greater focus of our clients, to replace invasive vegetation with native or at least non-invasive, non-native vegetation. So we're finding that there's a high demand for our service based on a huge invasive species problem that exists here in the Midwest and all over the country. The problem is the same, but the vegetation might be different. So along parks and trails certainly are places where we don't want thorny vegetation sticking out across the trail, or poison ivy or poison oak in the trail where somebody could pick it up. Also vegetation management in sensitive places, like for example in Lake Park along a steep lake shore, where any other means of dealing with that vegetation might cause a great degree of erosion, or we wouldn't perhaps want to use chemicals next to a waterway because we don't want runoff into the water. Choked drainages, so if we have creek beds and drainage channels and that sort of thing that are overgrown with vegetation, they don't do what they're intended to do, which is move water and move it at a particular speed. Choked drainages can really slow things down and back things up and create flooding problems. Overgrown utility easements are a potential application for goats. Fire risk due to vegetative fuels. So if any of you are listening from the southwest and western part of the United States, that's where targeted grazing is often used, is to reduce the amount of fuel that might hurry along a wildfire and cause damage. So you're probably familiar with subdivisions, hiring crews of goats to create a defensible space with less vegetation that might be fuel for a fire. Here in the Midwest, a great application is for a landscape that needs prescribed fire, but where that fire is impractical. So oftentimes that is a prairie grass restoration or a prairie remnant that is within city limits, perhaps in a park or surrounded by a subdivision. And what would really be nice for that prairie planting is if we could burn that off every few years. It's healthy for the vegetation, it's healthy for the prairie. But in some places, because of the smoke and the danger from the fire, that's just not practical. Fortunately, we can accomplish much the same effect by applying a herd of goats. We can graze it down. We can, the goats will stomp old vegetation into the ground. They'll kind of chop up the surface and aerate the surface of the soil. and have much the same effect as a prescribed burn would. Maintenance of sewage lagoons and retired landfills, surface mine reclamations and maintenance. Perhaps we have a platted subdivision that hasn't been built out and needs some maintenance. That would be a great application for goats as well. In these pictures here, you can see where we have helped a property owner with a trail. They were working hard to keep this trail open, but every year the vegetation on either side just kept creeping further and further into it. In fact, you could walk down the middle of this mowed path and find poison ivy right in the middle. Another problem they were having is that with the vegetation creeping in, every time they ran their mower through, they were worried of what they might hit, because this woody vegetation just kept growing and growing and getting closer and closer to the path, so they were unable to push it back at the edges. So we brought in goats, you can see in the lower picture there, and just opened up the sides of that path. Now the goats will defoliate everything. They'll eat back a lot of the soft branch tips of that woody vegetation, but they don't eliminate the woody trunks of those plants, and you can see some of that in the bottom picture as well. But what it does a fantastic job of is creating a situation where that property owner can now go in and with a small saw or perhaps just some nippers can clip off that vegetation, and they can see exactly where they're working. They can see what their mower will and won't hit in a certain place, and it just makes it much easier to maintain over time. So why would we use grazing? Well, grazing replicates historic conditions, especially here in the Midwest and in the Plain States. We had traditionally and historically huge herds of grazers. And those herds are gone for the most part, but that doesn't mean that the method needs to go away as well. We can treat grasslands and woodlands the way that they would have been treated pre-settlement. Grazing promotes species diversity. It builds soil over time. You've probably thought about this, but goats and other grazing animals leave manure behind. They stomp it into the ground. They churn up the surface of the soil, and they help break up old dead vegetation. Grazing requires no herbicide, or at least it requires less herbicide. So often what the goats will allow to be done is, rather than a broad spraying of herbicide over a huge area that will kill everything, once the goats go through, a crew can follow them and cut off the stems of the targeted vegetation and just paint a little bit of herbicide right on the stumps of those plants in a really judicious, targeted way. Grazing requires no mechanization, though sometimes grazing is used in combination with mechanization, but we can use less fuel burning equipment if we use goats instead. Requires no burning. Again, we could use grazing in conjunction with burning, but it's not necessarily required once we use goats. In fact, I think if you were to rewind things 25 or 30 years, the practice of prescribed burning was then about where prescribed grazing is now. It seemed a little weird, a little bit new, and a little bit strange, but over time prescribed burning became widely adopted, to the point where it's almost used too often now. If we think about, let's think about our Plain States and Midwest prairies pre-settlement. How many times would the conditions have been just right? The moisture in the grass and the moisture in the air and the storm passing over just right so that lightning would start a fire that would burn a large swath of the prairie. Well, it probably happened. I mean, it did happen. It happened with some amount of frequency, but it was probably very likely that that happened with less frequency than a given acre of land was grazed by a large herd of ruminant animals. And so in some ways, when we rely exclusively on prescribed burning, we're relying on only one component of how prairies and landscapes were naturally treated over time. And so in a sense, by using targeted grazing, we're adding in that second component that's been missing all along. Grazing also works in difficult and dangerous terrain. Managed grazing provides little opportunity for erosion, little to no opportunity for erosion, and it can save human labor. So that's why grazing. So now why goats rather than other animals? Well, we'd love to go really natural and load up a trailer with bison to use for our targeted grazing animals, but that's a challenge. Goats, on the other hand, fit nicely in a trailer and are fairly easy to handle. Another advantage of goats is that they're actually browsers rather than grazers. So we use the term targeted grazing all the time, but goats tend to wander around an area looking for their favorite things, and they tend to focus on woody weeds and brush and broadleaf weeds. They also tend to start grazing at about eye level and work their way down from there. So while they will eat grass, it's a relatively small percentage of their diet if given lots of options. And so in this picture you can see the goats going to work on an eastern cedar tree, which they often do a nice job on. And that's fairly typical for them to start with that brushy vegetation rather than the grass. They also have a preference for problem and invasive species. And this is pure coincidence that we capitalize on. If we put our goats in a piece of woodland that is, has some grass at the edges, and it has native trees and tree saplings, but it also has invasive non-native honeysuckle and buckthorn and multiflora rose and that sort of thing, they really do prefer those species. That, again, that's just us taking advantage of their natural tendencies. They really like those brushy species. Also, what's important is that those species did not evolve with grazing like many of our native species did. So our native species can absorb grazing and actually bounce back healthier from it than they were before. Brush, on the other hand, is actually fairly easily damaged by grazing because it did not evolve with large herds of grazers here in the United States. Another advantage of goats is that they've actually been found not to spread seeds, at least through their digestive systems and through their manure. This is really important. Cattle and sheep actually, if they consume seeds, will just spread those seeds around with a nice dose of fertilizer. But goats, perhaps because of the enzymes in their digestive system, or perhaps because of the way they chew, actually leave very few seeds viable once they pass through them. Goats are really agile, which means we can put them on extremely rough terrain. Really the only limits terrain-wise are the degree to which their handlers can install fencing. The goats are not bothered by steep terrain at all, and in fact they really love it. So that's a big advantage for goats as well. They're very light-footed, so they create virtually no erosion if they're managed well. They convert a nuisance into meat. One of my favorite statistics is that half or more of the goat meat that's consumed in the United States is imported from New Zealand and Australia. That means there's a high demand for goat meat in the United States, and that demand is growing. And we can meet that need, or help to meet that demand, by raising goats that are converting a nuisance into meat. And this is really high quality feed. All this nuisance vegetation is really high quality feed, but only high quality feed for goats. Sheep and cattle and other animals cannot convert the same kinds of vegetation that goats can. So it's really a fantastic situation for us, where we can provide some of the most sustainable meat in the world by grazing it on vegetation that serves no other purpose and in fact should go away, and offsetting the use of chemicals and gas burning machinery at the same time. And finally, another great advantage of goats is that they're cute. And I don't mean that in just a superficial way. I mean, goats are cute in a sense that allows them to be the best possible animal for this service when it comes to engaging the public and engaging the community. Goats are, I probably should have paused for you to to give an ah over these baby goats here. But goats really are engaging creatures. They're curious, they all have personalities, they're adorable, and they attract attention like no other animal could. And that provides a great opportunity for public outreach, for education, for telling people you know, about what you're trying to accomplish with the goats when it comes to water quality improvements and other conservation goals. And just to illustrate that, here are the kids at that park in Lake Park, Iowa that came from the nearby school. I bet that teacher didn't have that kind of attention in the classroom that day. But when they came out to see the goats, they are clicked in, really engaged, and ready to learn. And it's a great opportunity to talk to them about planning and about conservation. So this is how it works. In the upper picture there you see some fencing. That's actually an electric netting. All of the horizontal strands on that fencing are electrified. The verticals are not. And this fencing is really flexible. It comes in a roll. It has fence posts woven right into it. So we just unroll this stuff and stick the fence posts into the ground. Because it's so flexible, we can, for example, isolate an area with an invasive species problem, but perhaps go around that native oak sapling that's really doing well, or around that little patch of native vegetation that we want to preserve. It also means we can go up and down hills and across creeks with no trouble at all. Below that picture, the lower picture, you'll see a solar fence energizer. So this is what creates the electricity that goes through the fence. It has batteries inside of it, and it uses the solar panel to charge the batteries, and the batteries actually put out the electric pulse, and that's what keeps it going through the night and on cloudy days when there's not much sun is those batteries. This is amazing equipment, and it's really innovative stuff, and we could not provide this service without these inventions here. This is what makes it possible for us. Because we don't have to plug in anywhere, we can go to some pretty remote locations with no power source nearby. And it's proven to be very reliable as well. Our goats are very well conditioned to it. We don't have escapees at all. This stuff is made by a company that actually happens to be just down the road from us here in Iowa called Premier One Supplies. They make some fantastic equipment, and again, we couldn't do it without them. So we use this netting, fencing, and the solar energizers to concentrate the goats in targeted areas, and then we rotate them from area to area. So we found that the goats work best if they're concentrated at a relatively high density in that fenced-in enclosure. When they are close together, they compete with each other. They don't want to let their buddy over there get that little bit of vegetation. They want it for themselves. So they're much more efficient, and they work a lot faster if we put them in a relatively tight area. It also helps us monitor them a little more carefully because we can look at a relatively small area to see how progress is going and to make sure that we're not creating any erosion issues, as opposed to a very large area where the goats would wander freely looking for their favorite things, and then we'd have to monitor a much larger area all at once. As I already mentioned, our targeted grazing service and targeted grazing in general can be used all on its own, or it can be combined with prescribed fire, manual removal, or herbicides. And really, except in rare occasion, an integrated approach tends to be the best approach for fighting back invasive vegetation in particular. So here are some of the strategies we take. One of the goals that we have whenever we work with a customer is to understand what their objectives are and what their values are. So if they want to use no vegetation and they never want to spark up a chainsaw or get in a heavy piece of equipment, then we can stress and kill unwanted vegetation over time with grazing only. If that's following that strategy is important to our customer, then we want to do a couple of grazings at least of a given area, and we want to do it at key times of the year because it's the only method we're relying on, so we want to do the best we can with the goats only. We can graze to reduce hazards and then prep for follow-up, and so that's what we were doing in the city of Lake Park. Is really we're just trying to open up things there and make it possible for the Public Works Department to go in and safely remove the remainder of the vegetation once the goats have kind of gotten on top of things. We can also manually remove the vegetation and then use the goats, say the following year after that manual removal, because all that vegetation, if it's not treated with a herbicide, is going to resprout, and it's going to send shoots out in every direction, and if we don't get on top of it right after it's cut, then we're going to have a bigger problem than we had before. And some of our customers just hire us to come out and do a periodic cleanup. Hey, would you run those goats through my woods and open things up and make it look better for now, and when it's ugly again, I'll call you back in a few years. That tends to be our private property customers. Our conservation-oriented and especially public sector customers tend to follow one of the first three strategies. So I want to show you some before and after pictures here just to show you what goats can do. In this case, this property owner, there were a couple of retired prairie enthusiasts, and they had restored prairie on much of their large property. And they had tried to restore it on this hillside, but because of the steepness of the hill, they weren't able to get a good seeding originally, and then they also weren't able to maintain it over time. So you see the fence in the lower left corner. To the left of that, we have some pretty high quality prairie that's well established, but above that fence on the hillside, not so much. So we brought the goats in, and after a couple of days, this is what it looked like. Again, I'd point out that native vegetation responds really well to grazing. Non-native typically does not. So by coming through and grazing it off like this, we're having the same effect that a fire would have. And we're setting back the non-native vegetation so that the native vegetation can continue to get established and eventually try to crowd out the non-native stuff. So just a different view of that hillside. Again, to the left is the established prairie, and to the right is the slope that we're working on. And that's what it looked like after just a few days with the goats around. And one more picture just to give you an idea of the slope that we were working on this project. It was hard to walk up and down, but the goats, of course, had no trouble with it at all. So I am presenting here. I'm coming to you out of Iowa, where we have a lot of farms and a lot of small farmsteads and even non-farmers living out in the country on small little acreages. And that's the case here. We often have old farm buildings on those acreages, and things can get a little out of control over time. So this customer hired us just to do basically a building site cleanup. And this is one of my favorite before and after pictures because we found a van. The goats found a van on this property, and the customer, who was kind of an odd duck, came strolling out when this project was done and said, "Oh yeah, I forgot that was in there." So we helped him relocate his van with our goats. So a little picture. This is mostly honeysuckle in this picture, which is a big problem where we live. We have a goat there kind of circled in the middle just so you can see her. And this is what it looks like after the goats are done. And then another building cleanup site, but also an invasive species removal type of project. So in this case, the goats were able to eat all of those vines up on top of that shed by climbing up onto the old tractor and onto the old tractor seat, and then jumping on the tire of the tractor and up onto the roof and making those vines disappear. And again, I showed you this picture of the pushing back the unwanted vegetation from the edges of the trail. And then for this picture, you're going to need to kind of get some perspective here. So if you just kind of keep your eyes on these two trees, that will help you see the improvement. The goats can eat 6 or even 7 feet high. They do stand on their back legs and lean on trees and stretch as high as they can. And in some cases, they'll push down saplings and eat all the leaves off of them. They'll also debark some species. Young, soft bark species, they will clean up the bark in some cases. So now let's get back to Lake Park. Now that you know a lot about targeted grazing and how it works, Lake Park's project quickly went from a lake visibility project to a shoreline restoration and water quality improvement project. When I first met with the city, with the Parks Department, or pardon me, the chairman of the park board, and with Wade, the question arose, well, is this permanent? If we put the goats here, what will happen when the goats are gone? And I had to be honest with them and say, well, growth will slow down on the slope, and it won't get any worse for a little while, but eventually that vegetation will grow back if all you do is apply goats. And that the permanent solution is to replace that non-native, unwanted vegetation with native vegetation. And in our landscape here in Iowa, that would mean local types of prairie grasses. And I love this graphic down here in the lower right, in particular this photo, because it shows the root depths of some of these native Iowa plants. The depths of the roots in most cases far exceed the height of the vegetation above ground. And that's what kept Lake Park's, the name of the lake is actually Silver Lake, that's what kept Silver Lake's lakeshore in place long before European settlement. And now instead we have woody vegetation with relatively shallow, big roots that are easily washed out and do not hold the lakeshore in place. Once we kind of headed down that path, heading toward a more permanent and natural solution, the Natural Resources Conservation Service got involved, as did the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, to help fund this project. And we sent out just a few simple press releases, made a few phone calls to the local media, and that resulted in an overwhelming amount of press for this little town in northwest Iowa. And it's important to remember, this is in the far corner of the state, far away from any urban center, and they are not used to getting attention. In fact, they often feel like they are ignored and that people forget they're there way up in the corner of the state. So this was amazing for the city to get the kind of press that they did. And again, here are those kids on their field trip out to look at the goats, and that's just an example of what happened when the goats were there. Behind those kids you can see the road that kind of does a circle through the park, and that road was busier than it had ever been while our goats were there. All hours of the day and night, people cruising through just to get a look at the goats. Here are the goats at work or taking a break from work. And again, I wanted to show you this picture to show you what this railing or the vegetation on either side of this railing looked like before. And here it is later on in the project. You can see the railing there in the lower right corner. Now I do have to say that the goats can't take 100% credit for this. The goats again went through and they opened things up and they got rid of some of the dangerous plants, the thorns, the poison ivy. They made visibility less of an issue, and they made it possible for the workers that would come later to be able to navigate that shoreline, be able to see their feet, see where they were stepping, and see where they were cutting. And so this is after both the goat crew and the human crew went through. After that was done, they hydroseeded some native plants, native grass mix onto the lakeshore. And again, the goal here is to get the that deep-rooted vegetation along that steep shore to hold the soil in place, not allow it to get washed out. Another huge advantage of that vegetation is that it acts like a natural filter. So any runoff we would get from the park, we hope will be infiltrated down through those deep root systems. They then covered things up with with an erosion blanket, and I wish I had a really nice picture of how the prairie looks now. It's still being established and growing up, but we don't have a fresh picture for you. So a little bit about Silver Lake. It has a little over 17,000 acres of watershed, mostly in good old-fashioned Iowa row crops, soybeans and corn. A portion of the city also drains into the lake, a little over 1,000 acres of lake surface itself. And this is a shallow lake. This is really typical of prairie pothole lakes in Iowa, and especially in northwest Iowa. It's also what keeps it from being as popular as some of those tourist lakes down the road. It's only 7 feet deep on average, and it is on Iowa's list of impaired waterways. This is a Trapper's Bay at one end of the lake, and back in 1930 this picture was taken. And if you'll keep your eye over here on this part of the lake, you'll see the kind of silting that has occurred and the sediment that has been washed into the lake. You can see all the extra land that is there now that wasn't there in 1930. So that's a big issue for Lake Park and Silver Lake's water quality. Here's a picture of the feeder creek, kind of give you an idea of the washouts that occur along that creek. Again, because it's surrounded just by flat row crop land that is in production. There's not a lot to slow down the water runoff, and so we do get some pretty good washouts in that part of the country. Another problem Lake Park had in Silver Lake was a pretty bad algae bloom, and this little part of the lake, it's a little cove, and just uphill behind these trees is the park where the goats worked. So this is an area where stagnant water collected and allowed the algae bloom to happen, and it got to smelling really bad every year, and it was just something that the residents of Lake Park had kind of learned to live with. So those are some of the problems with Silver Lake, but here's where we tried to start sorting out some solutions. There was one small rain garden project done in the city about the same time as Wade Wagner's arrival as city administrator. The community was not really engaged by it. It was not that dramatic of a project. The concept was a little bit abstract. In this part of the world, this is a fairly elderly population in this community, and water quality improvements and innovative approaches to water quality are not on the radar screen of a lot of these folks in northwest Iowa. So it was hard to get traction with this little project. It was a nice project, but ultimately did not capture the public's attention. Post-goats, though, after the goats had come and gone, there was much broader public interest in improving water quality and the innovative approaches that can be taken to improve water quality in the lake. And the concept of water quality improvement was now associated with this visual cue. The goats had become a mascot for water improvement, water quality improvement in this town. And it was a mascot that the citizenry could kind of feel like they owned, like they were their goats. Even after the goats left, it kind of left that feeling like they owned the goats. And there was a sense of excitement because Lake Park was in the news. And again, tiny little town here, Lake Park was never in the news. So it was fantastic for them. They were excited about the attention they got. They were excited to be one of the more innovative communities in Iowa and to get some credit for it. The next step that came out of the GOAT project, a watershed study was funded and several spin-off projects. And really a new economic development strategy sprung out of this project, and that is Lake Park as an outdoor paradise. The Okobojies to the east would get all of the attention as the tourist lakes, the place to go to party and spend lots of money and to have an expensive house. But Silver Lake and Lake Park could be the place that focused on natural resources and water quality and hunting and fishing and that sort of thing. So, this picture is kind of illustrative of that. We went from plain old Lake Park to Lake Park that had a new image and a new identity. And out of that came some recognition for the city of Lake Park. I know this is hard to read because it's a actual physical clipping out of the newspaper, but this is from the Des Moines Register, which is Iowa's largest newspaper. The Des Moines Register often hands out a rose and a thistle to people and organizations, and of course a rose is meant to recognize an achievement, and a thistle is meant to be critical of some action taken by another group. And so Lake Park was thrilled to have been granted a rose by the Des Moines Register. And Lake Park's project ended up on the cover of the Iowa League of Cities magazine. And so now it was also the city government starting to be recognized for how innovative the project was, and to have their project put in front of other communities all over the state of Iowa. And this is pretty cool. You remember that cove that had all that horrible algae bloom in it? Well, as part of the water improvement study and the projects that spun off of that, they got some funding to put an aerating fountain in that cove to keep it fresh and keep that water circulating. They named it Silver Spring, and they had this dedication. Now, again, this is a town of about 1,500 people, and they had over 100 people show up at the dedication of this fountain. And this fountain is, I mean, it's pretty, but it's just a fountain. But people were engaged, people were plugged in because of the GOAT project that happened a few months before. I love this picture in the upper left. The light bulbs on this fountain can be changed into different colors. And early on in the presentation, I mentioned that the local high school's football field is right adjacent to this park. So this actually turned into a tradition where homecoming week every year now, the captains of the football team wade into the cove and change the colors of the light bulbs to the school colors, which I think is just a really cool tradition. The project also set Lake Park off toward other outdoor sorts of amenities, including a proposed trap and skeet range. It also got them engaged in conservation efforts statewide and in legislation that would affect conservation efforts. This is something that the Lake Park leadership would never have done before, and that is to pen a letter to the state legislator asking for action on a piece of legislation. And this is an article from Pheasants Forever magazine. Pheasants Forever is a national conservation group, and they publish a magazine with a national circulation. And up in the right corner there is a picture of Wade Wagoner and his brother pheasant hunting as little boys. And so again, just that theme of Lake Park as an outdoor paradise. Lake Park was awarded the county, Dickinson County's first ever Environmental Stewardship Award, largely because of the GOAT project. And that is a picture of Wade and me receiving the award in environmental planning from the Iowa chapter of the APA in 2014 for the GOAT project. So that's just a rundown of the fantastic things that were generated out of this small GOAT project in Lake Park, Iowa. So how can you make something like this happen in your community? Well, I would say it's only a matter of time till you have citizens asking you about using targeted grazing inside city limits, and I would ask you if you're prepared for that. The pictures on the right there are before and after of just a very small postage stamp size lot in the center of a community. We were able to do that project in more or less an afternoon. And the neighbors, not only did they not complain, those who knew it happened were thrilled about it and excited about it and came to watch, and many neighbors never knew it even happened because we were in and out with very little disturbance. So your regs probably say something like this in your community: no horse, cow, calf, swine, etc., and goat is included in that, can be kept within the city's corporate limits on any lot or parcel of land. So obviously that creates a roadblock to a very innovative solution and a sustainable solution to a vegetation problem that we have all over the country. So I'd ask you this, what does kept mean? That little bit of code language that I read to you before says those animals cannot be kept. Well, I think it's important that you understand that targeted grazing is a very temporary service. It's much different than raising animals on a continual basis. Typically, we are in and out in a few days on an urban or suburban type of project, often less than that, 1 or 2 days. Another thing you could do is make an exception. So most animal control codes or zoning codes already have an exception built in for rodeos and circuses and similar petting zoos, animal-related things. Why not include a targeted grazing exception in that portion of your code? I would encourage you, of course, to set some reasonable limits. Even me, as a provider of targeted grazing, recognizes that there's a need for limits and that you're going to be dealing with targeted grazing services, some of which are really dedicated and professional and some of which are less so. So some limits are necessary. So I'd recommend that you only allow goats and sheep. You might want to keep in mind, though, that some goat and sheep herds include guardian animals, either donkeys or llamas or alpacas. And so you'd have to make a judgment call about whether those would be allowed or not. We'd recommend only castrated males and females be used on these jobs. And I would really like to discourage you from limiting the number of animals that are used in targeted grazing in your communities. The number of animals is really insignificant to the overall impact on a neighborhood. For example, if you only limited us to 10 animals, if we wanted to do an acre with 10 animals, that would put us there for 20 days. Whereas if you let us use any number of animals, we could come in there, we'd probably bring 40 in to do a small job of an acre or two, and we can do an acre in 4 to 5 days. So what I'd rather see you do as communities is establish some regulations that limit it to a certain number of adult animal days per acre per year. That's a mouthful, and I'd be happy to explain that further. Just contact me with the contact information at the back at the end of this presentation. But the point is, let's combine, let's think about how quickly we can be in and out on a project as being the significant determinant of whether the neighborhood is negatively impacted or not. It really has nothing to do with the total number of animals. I'd also really discourage you from requiring the targeted grazing service to be on site 24 hours a day. Again, it sounds like a good idea, but it actually creates more impact to have a guy like me sleeping in a pickup truck on the curb for 5 straight days than if you just set a maximum response time. Say, for example, that I need to be able to respond to a problem on the site within 20 minutes. That would be, I think, a much better solution. Certainly require the provider to be insured and require the provider to deliver proof of insurance as well. And I don't just mean insurance for his or her farm. This is a commercial service. It requires commercial liability insurance, and that's a different thing than the insurance that I'm just going to have at my farm where I raise animals there. Some things that I'd like you not to be terribly concerned about that seem a little bit scary at first are horns on animals. Horns on goats are a natural thing. It doesn't make them more or less dangerous, and actually I really think that dehorning animals is somewhat cruel, and I try to avoid that. So I would certainly want you to not worry about horns in your regulations. Electric fence deserves some mention because I'm sure that some of your communities don't allow electric fencing. And electric fence can sound scary if you think that there's a constant flow of very high voltage vegetation, pardon me, really high voltage electricity going through that fence. But that's not actually how these modern fence energizers work. The one I mentioned from Premier One Supplies, for example, and most other comparable ones send out very momentary pulses of electricity about every second or second and a half. And if I were to describe how it feels to be shocked by one of these, this is what I usually say to folks is, imagine that you're shuffling around your house in your stocking feet in the winter and you go and touch a doorknob and you get a static shock. Imagine the worst static shock you've ever gotten in your house. That's pretty close to what it feels like to touch our electric fences. It's sharp, it's not comfortable, but it's there and gone in a moment. And finally, manure. Certainly manure is something that deserves some consideration. But I would tell you that goat manure, like sheep manure, like deer manure, is dry, small, and without getting too graphic, just not wet and smelly the way that cattle manure would be, or some other type of livestock manure. It's a real benefit to the property to have that extra fertilizer on the property, and so as long as we're managing the goats well and moving them from one spot to the next as we should be, there's not a real concentration of manure that occurs. So I'd also direct you to a couple of resources if you'd like more information. The city of Salem, Oregon is one of the few communities in the U.S. that I think has proactively taken a look at their regulations to allow targeted grazing. And they have a nice publication that's meant for the public to read and understand the guidelines about targeted grazing in their community. I don't agree with everything, every bit of the city of Salem's approach toward targeted grazing, but I think it's really good, and I think they deserve some recognition for taking a proactive stance on grazing, because I think it's going to pop up in every one of your communities here within the next 5 years. Another nice resource is this publication, Prescribed Goat Grazing in Urban Settings by Salter, McDonald, and Richardson. They evaluate regulations from several communities and the degree to which they apply to targeted grazing. Some of them are actually at their root, they're urban agriculture type of regulations, but they do have some application to targeted grazing as well. So I'd recommend that you look at that resource if you'd like more information. And finally, there's my contact information and Wade Wagner's contact information. And we love to answer questions about this project and about goats and targeted grazing in general. So please inundate us with your questions. We'd love to get them. And as I understand it, we have set aside a fair amount of time for questions right now. So I'll turn that over to you, Christine.
All right, great. And we have a lot of questions coming in. So I'm just going to jump in and get started. There's a series of excuse me, questions about feeding the goats. Do people feed the goats, and does that reduce their efficiency?
Okay, couple of ways we can look at that. One question is, does the public or watchers feed the goats? And that we discourage that, but that does happen, but it doesn't happen with any, to a great enough degree that it actually slows down the goats' work. The other angle the person may be asking about is whether we have to feed them anything additional. And typically we don't. We will put a mineral supplement in the enclosure with the goats, and of course we'll provide water for the goats. But the vegetation that we are grazing on most of the time is really high quality feed. So if you are from Iowa, like I am, you might know that alfalfa hay, that alfalfa is the king of forages, and alfalfa has a crude protein content of 16 to 18%. Well, honeysuckle has a crude protein content of over 20%. Poison ivy can have a crude protein content of 26%. All this stuff is really good feed for the right type of animal that can actually consume and convert it. So we don't often have to supplement our goats with any extra feed.
Okay. You mentioned poison ivy. That's not a problem. Any kind of poison ivy, poison oak, anything like that. Goats don't have a problem with it like humans do.
No, goats do not seem to be affected by it at all. In fact, poison ivy is one of the first things that they'll locate and eat when we put them in a new spot. They love the stuff, and I have yet to see a goat affected by it.
Okay, interesting. Next question. I think you mentioned this before, but let's just go back through this again. The question is, are goats supervised continually during the targeted grazing treatments? And I believe the answer is yes.
we will visit the site more or less often depending on the demands of the site. So if it's an urban area with lots of people going by, lots of traffic, and lots of close neighbors, we will visit that site more often. But we typically do not stay with the goats 24 hours a day. Now, that's just us. That's just the approach we've chosen to take as a business. We do know that other companies like ours will provide 24-hour supervision. Again, we'd really recommend that you just have maximum response time rather than require us to be there all the time.
Okay, great. How does goat grazing compare to deer grazing? And the question is, would it discourage deer grazing?
Sure. Well, I guess at a physical level, it's very similar to deer grazing. Goats and deer are actually cousins. They do eat some of the same stuff. It's not going to impact the deer to any great degree because we're targeting the goats on relatively small areas at any one given time, and we're not really taking away the feed that the deer rely on. And again, we're also trying to take away non-native stuff and replace it with native vegetation. So there's not any real impact on the deer. There are some impacts that we need to consider of the deer on our goats and on our operation, but there's no negative impacts from our grazing on the deer.
Okay, next question, can goats work in combination with chickens? And I guess to broaden that, any other animal, I guess.
Sure. Well, let's start with chickens. Yeah, so a nice application is to, if I were just doing this on my farm, for example, I would love to use intensive management of my grazing operation, move my goats regularly, and follow the goats with a flock of chickens or turkeys to graze behind the goats. The chickens or turkeys will, pick through the goat's manure. They'll help desiccate the manure and dry it out so that you don't get any flies reproducing on the site, and the birds will also eat a lot of bugs. So, sure, it's a great idea. I don't know, I can't figure out a way to make it practical in an urban or suburban setting, though. As far as sheep or as far as other animals, we will occasionally combine sheep with our goats if we are working on a site that is really grassy, mostly herbaceous vegetation. We'll add sheep because that's more up their alley and they are a little more efficient on that type of vegetation than the goats are.
Okay. As you're, in many cases, not there 100% of the time, are there any concerns about predators?
I mean, we're always concerned about predators, but we've had very little issue with predators. And I attribute that to two things. So one of the predators, especially here in the Midwest, that we'd worry about is coyotes or coyotes. And we think just by virtue of the fact that we are always moving our goats from one place to the next, it keeps the coyotes from really being able to figure things out. They would typically sit back and watch for a little while before they approached, and as soon as you change locations, it kind of resets them back to zero again. They have to figure it all out again. Also, the other thing that helps us with predators is our electric fencing from Premier. That's really good stuff, and it's hard for a coyote or a stray dog, for example, to get very close to that without getting its nose on the wire. And that's typically all it takes. So those two things in combination. We currently do not use guardian dogs or any kind of guardian animal. We may have to in the future, but for the moment we feel like that adds more complication than the problems it solves to add dogs to the mix.
Okay, yeah, a couple of people had questions about that. herding type question. So you took care of that. What about water? How do they get water when they're on site doing their thing if there's not a water source close by?
Yeah, we often will provide the water. We use a bulk tank in a pickup truck or on an ATV to deliver some water to just a big 40-gallon water tub inside the enclosure. Of course, if we're doing a really large job and we've got 200 plus goats on that job, we'll set out more water tanks and it's more of a challenge, but we will deliver the water in all cases. If the property happens to include a creek or a pond, we'll often fence that in so the goats can access that. That saves us a little bit of trouble. What's interesting though is that goats really do not consume very much water. Their consumption of water goes up dramatically as the moisture content of the vegetation drops. So in certain weather patterns and at certain times of the year we have to provide more water, but oftentimes we're putting out water just so the public can see that there is water there for the goats, and we end up dumping it all out when we have to move the goats to the next spot.
Okay. What about goats on the roadside? Is that a good idea, a bad idea? Depends on the community.
Yeah, there's so many variables we'd have to consider before we did a job on the roadside. You know, the traffic volume and the speed limit in that area. But I think there's some fantastic applications for goats in public right-of-way and even on roadsides. Here in Iowa and in other parts of the Midwest, we're having huge problems with a plant called wild parsnip. Wild parsnip makes poison ivy look like a walk in the park, you know, if you're exposed to it. And wild parsnip pops up all along our roadways here in Iowa and in our you know, interstate interchanges and that sort of thing. And the road departments spend a great deal of money spraying it with herbicides. So we think potentially under the right conditions that we could get that done, but we'd have to take into account a lot of things before we put them in a roadway.
Okay, next question. So things like herbicides and insecticides, or even surface runoff that, you know, might have contaminants in them, is that all any of that a concern?
As far as the health of the goats?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, it is, and it's something that we're aware of all the time, and sometimes we are called by customers to graze an area that they previously treated with a herbicide unsuccessfully. And we're okay with that as long as we know when it was sprayed and what was applied. We do want there to be enough of a rest there that we're not concerned about any contamination for our goats. Our goats are a meat goat herd also, and so we are always aware of what we're putting into them. But as long as we've got 6 months or so after the last application of a herbicide, I think we'd generally be okay with that. As far as runoff and other contaminants, I wish it was something that we could control or even be well informed about on every site we go to. But we just do not usually have enough backstory to know what's been used or applied or might be running through the area. But unfortunately, I'd have to admit that that's pretty much the case with every property in Iowa right now. I mean, we are surrounded with agricultural chemicals all the time. So if we drew a hard line in the sand about which projects we'll do and which ones we won't, we would never do any projects.
Okay. Let's talk about price. We have a lot of questions. A lot of questions about the cost per acre, the cost per goat, typical costs, typical timelines, things like that. And I don't know which angle you want to approach it from, just based on how fee schedules are set. But if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's the answer everybody always wants. So I'm happy to talk about that. we decided not long after we started that we were going to be charging per acre, and that we were going to be not the kind of operation that will rent you a couple of goats for the summer for your backyard, mostly for entertainment. We have customers who really value the novelty factor and the entertainment factor of having goats. And that's fantastic. That's great. But we really strive to focus on the conservation benefits and the property improvement benefits. And we believe that the best way to do that is to go use a by the acre charge and to apply an efficient number of goats to a property. So we don't charge by the goat, per goat per day or anything like that. We charge by the acre. If you are close to one of our representatives, we can do projects under 10 acres for in the neighborhood of $900 per acre. If we get over 10 acres, our prices drop dramatically down to around $500 per acre. And in those cases, we'll send out a lot of goats on a big trailer, and we'll put somebody close to the job site all the time and try to get that project done as quickly as possible. And we'll do 1 acre to 2 acres a day at that scale. What's more typical in like an urban or suburban type of setting is more that $900 to $1,000 per acre price, and we'll use a group of about 40 goats, and we'll do 1 acre every 3 to 5 days.
Okay, so just asking for a friend, what happens if you want to buy your own goat and keep them year-round for your own personal use? How much does a goat run?
Great question. Well, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, goat meat and even goat milk are in really high demand right now. So good examples of meat and dairy breeding goats will cost $300 to $500 per head. And that's for a goat that's not registered, not a show goat, nothing like that, just a commercial goat that has good breeding potential will cost $300 to $500. Around here in Iowa and in the Midwest, there are little livestock auction barns all over the place, and you could probably go there and pick up a goat for $90 to $100, but I wouldn't recommend that. There's a reason they're for sale in most cases, and so I'd recommend that you go to a place that produces breeding animals if you want to do that, and be prepared to spend a little bit of money.
Okay, thanks. How many goats do you typically use per acre?
Yeah, so if it's a smallish job, like less than 10 acres, it's pretty common for us to take 30 to 40 goats, and we'll just bring a standard size livestock trailer or horse trailer and do that 2 or 3 acre job at a rate of 3 to 5 days per acre. But if it's a bigger job, we'll get a commercial livestock trailer and we'll put 200 or more goats on it, and again try to do 1 acre or 2 per day.
Okay. Next question. How about some best practices? Do you have examples, other than the case study that you presented, but are there websites or communities, other communities that have utilized this, perhaps maybe bigger communities or even smaller communities, just for folks to get more information?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's not too challenging of an internet search to find communities that have used goats, especially in the Southwest and Western states, and then in the Virginia, Washington D.C. and South, it's become fairly common too. The plants are all different depending on the place in the country where it happens, but there are a fair number of cities that are doing this, Lake Park is one of a handful of communities that we've worked for. We're doing proposals for other cities all the time, so I think it's becoming more and more common. What's interesting though is that we can never predict how a city is going to respond to the idea based on the size of the community or the perceived progressiveness of the community. We could go to one of our bigger communities that we would guess would certainly be aware of this targeted grazing thing and certainly be in favor of it, and they've adopted all sorts of sustainability policies in the past, and this seems like the perfect community for this sort of thing, and we'll get shut down right at the door saying, sorry, don't allow livestock in our town inside city limits, and that's it, and there's no convincing them otherwise. And then you'll go to another community where you would guess, well, they're conservative and they're kind of a smaller town and not typically known for being progressive, and we'll go in and pitch the idea and they'll think it's great and we'll have no problems whatsoever. And then we'll have everything in between. So yeah, I wish I could point you to cities based on a certain population threshold or a certain level of progressiveness, but it's really random right now. But take a look online, and there's lots of examples.
Okay, and specifically there's a couple questions on this, so I wanted to kind of point this one out. Are there examples of goats being used in for wetland restoration or just in conservation areas?
In conservation areas in general, yes. That's one of the best applications and one of the most one of the areas where the idea is being most readily adopted. Parks and conservation areas and that sort of thing. Wetlands are a bit of a challenge, though, because goats really do not like water, and they don't even like to stand in mud, really. So grazing at the edges of wetlands can be a challenge, and you would have to time it just right for a dry spell when the wetland is drawn down in order to get the goats to do what you'd want them to do. That said, we're often called to deal with a grass that does thrive in wet soils, reed canary grass. It's a non-native here in Iowa. And under the right circumstances, they do great on that plant. And they would do great in other wetland environments if you could time it correctly, but it's a bit of a challenge.
Okay. So replanting with native vegetation is important after goats are done. If you need to go back in for a cleanup, do the goats browse down the native vegetation that you replanted?
Yes, they do. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Again, the native plants typically are well adapted to grazing. They evolved with grazing, as a principal means of promoting the growth of native vegetation. So that's not typically an issue. I mean, that's one of the great things about using goats is that the native plants are going to respond well to it. The non-natives are not going to respond well to it. So I would have no issue with grazing a native landscape to eliminate a relative handful of non-native invasive plants. The challenge with that, though, is if you do have, let's say, a prairie planting, for example, that's doing well, but you just have scattered invasives in it, grazing it is not going to do any harm to those native plants, but you are investing a lot of time and money into grazing a large area to get a relative handful of scattered invasive plants. And so you might be better off to go in and just hire a crew to go in and cut out and apply a small amount of herbicide to those non-natives. We really work best in places where there are concentrations of the problem plant.
Okay. Is this a year-round operation, or do the goats take the winter off, assuming you live in an area where it gets cold and snowy in the winter?
Right. Our operation is a seasonal operation. In fact, we're just winding down for the winter right now. We also have to figure out a way to get our goats bred at some time of the year without putting those intact males out on the jobs like I recommended earlier in the presentation. So it actually works pretty nicely that our goats come home for the winter. In other parts of the country, you certainly could graze at least several months more than we're able to here in Iowa. But the plants really need to be green and growing to have the best effect. So even in places where the weather would allow grazing year-round, that doesn't mean that you're going to have plants that are not in a dormant state, and we'd rather graze them when they are not in a dormant state.
Okay. I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up here. One last question. Do you personally have any goats?
I do personally have a lot of goats. Yeah, about 70 or 80 goats, and my business partner has another 70 or 80, and next year we should be up to about close to 300 goats combined, and we occasionally lease additional goats from other goat producers as well, depending on the demand for our service in any given year.
Okay. All right, well, that'll wrap us up. Thank you, Aaron Steele, for joining us today, and for the Nebraska chapter for sponsoring this webcast. If you have any further questions, there were some questions about whether or not goats eat very specific plants, so I'm just leaving you to email him separately if you would like to inquire further about that. Thanks again, and everyone have a great weekend.